The scanner beeped twice, then displayed the words that made the entire research team burst into laughter. Access level, ZERO restricted user. Dr. Harrison Vex, the lead researcher at Thornfield Institute's Advanced Digital Archives, couldn't contain his amusement as he stared at the small woman standing before the security checkpoint. Level 0? He chuckled, turning to his colleagues. I didn't even know they still issued those. What is this? Some kind of joke? The woman, Nora Castellane, stood quietly with her worn leather satchel, saying nothing as the snickers echoed through the pristine white corridors of the world's most exclusive research facility. Her library card looked ancient compared to the holographic access badges worn by the other researchers. Simple plastic rectangle that seemed to belong in a different century. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But 3 hours later, when the Institute's quantum computing system crashed during the most critical data analysis in their history, when every PhD-wielding genius in the building stood helpless as decades of research threatened to vanish into digital oblivion, when the emergency protocols failed and the backup systems froze, it was that same Level 0 card that unlocked access to systems that weren't supposed to exist. And in the following 6 minutes, while the world's brightest minds watched in stunned silence, Nora Castellane single-handedly salvaged not just their research, but prevented what would have been the greatest scientific catastrophe of the 21st century. The Thornfield Institute for Advanced Research stood like a gleaming fortress of glass and steel in the hills overlooking Meridian City, its reputation built on exclusivity and intellectual superiority. Only the most distinguished researchers, Nobel laureates, and tech industry legends could gain access to its legendary digital Nexus, a repository containing the world's most classified scientific data, cutting-edge research, and experimental technologies. The facility's security system was legendary: biometric scanners, AI-powered authentication protocols, and a color-coded access hierarchy that determined exactly which digital treasures each researcher could access. At the top were the platinum researchers, former heads of state scientific advisors, inventors of world-changing technologies, the intellectual elite whose very presence elevated the Institute's prestige. Gold-level researchers were respected university professors and industry leaders. Silver granted access to promising doctoral candidates and emerging scientists. Bronze was reserved for administrative staff and visiting scholars. And then there was Level 0. Nobody at Thornfield had seen a Level 0 clearance in over a decade. According to the archives, it was a deprecated classification originally created for library science interns and data entry assistants, essentially the academic equivalent of janitors, with computer access. Most researchers assumed the classification had been eliminated years ago, a relic from the Institute's early days when they still allowed support staff limited system access for basic administrative tasks. So when Nora appeared at the morning security checkpoint, her faded library card triggering the ancient Level 0 designation, it was like watching someone try to enter a luxury restaurant with a coupon from 1995. Dr. Vex, who held platinum clearance and regularly consulted with world governments on cybersecurity matters, found the situation genuinely amusing. Here was this unremarkable woman, mid-30s, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a cardigan that looked like it came from a thrift store, carrying what appeared to be the lowest possible security clearance ever issued. "Excuse. Ma'am, miss," Dr. Vex had said with barely concealed condescension. "I think there might be some mistake. This facility is reserved for advanced researchers. Are you perhaps looking for the public library? It's about 15 miles back toward the city center." His colleagues, Dr. Reginald Howe from Cambridge, Dr. Yuki Tanaka from the Tokyo Institute of Technology, and Dr. Amara Singh from the Mumbai Quantum Research Center gathered around to witness what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment of confused civilian accidentally wandering into the wrong building. But Nora had simply held up a crumpled piece of paper, an official appointment letter bearing the Institute's letterhead and the signature of Director Cornelius Brambleworth himself. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I have a research appointment scheduled for today. Section 7 Alpha, subsection 12. The researchers exchanged glances. Section 7 Alpha was deep in the Institute's classified archives, containing research so sensitive that even some platinum clearance holders couldn't access it. Dr. Vex's laughter echoed through the marble lobby. Section 7 Alpha, with level 0 clearance? My dear woman, I have platinum access, and even I need special authorization for some materials in that section. Your little library card probably can't even open the cafeteria doors." The security guard, Marcus Ironwood, ran the card through the scanner again, producing the same result. Access level 0, restricted user. The system's automated voice even added an apologetic note. Limited access granted to basic digital catalog searching and document viewing only. What none of them knew was that 3 floors below, in the Institute's most secure server room, that innocuous level 0 designation was about to trigger protocols that hadn't been activated in 15 years. Systems that the current staff didn't even know existed. Clearance levels that transcended their neat little hierarchy of platinum, gold, and silver. Because sometimes the most dangerous access isn't the highest level. Sometimes it's level 0. And in 3 hours, when their world started collapsing around them, they would discover that Nora Castellane's worthless library card was the only thing standing between them and complete digital annihilation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nora Castellane looked like everything the Thornfield Institute was not. At 34, she possessed none of the polished confidence that characterized the facility's typical researchers. Her appearance seemed almost deliberately unremarkable shoulder-length chestnut hair that she kept tucked behind her ears rather than styled, wire-rimmed glasses that had clearly seen better years, and a wardrobe that suggested she shopped exclusively at discount stores. While other researchers wore tailored blazers with university pins and designer accessories that subtly broadcast their academic pedigree, Nora dressed like a small-town librarian who'd gotten lost on her way to work. Her physical presence only reinforced the researchers' assumptions about her inadequacy. Standing barely 5'4" in sensible flat shoes, she seemed to shrink even smaller in the Institute's soaring lobbies with their 30-foot ceilings and intimidating architecture, where Dr. Vex commanded attention with his imposing frame and booming voice, where Dr. Singh carried herself with the regal bearing of someone accustomed to deference, where Dr. Tanaka moved with the precise confidence of a master craftsman. Nora simply existed quietly, unobtrusively, almost apologetically. The contrast became even more pronounced when she spoke. Her voice carried none of the authoritative tones that echoed through Thornfield's halls daily. She didn't pepper her sentences with impressive terminology or casual references to her publications in prestigious journals. When the security guard asked for her identification, she didn't launch into explanations about her credentials or drop names of famous mentors. She simply handed over her documents and waited, as if she were accustomed to being questioned, accustomed to having her legitimacy challenged. First time at Thornfield? Dr. Howe had asked with the kind of patronizing friendliness reserved for obvious outsiders. His Cambridge accent carried the weight of centuries of academic tradition, making Nora's simple "no" actually sound even more out of place. The way she said it, without elaboration, without the typical academic one-upmanship, only confirmed their suspicions that she didn't belong in their world of intellectual combat and scholarly achievement. Dr. Tanaka, who had revolutionized quantum computing protocols and held 17 patents in advanced cryptography, studied Nora with the clinical interest of someone examining an unusual specimen. "What's your field of research?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine curiosity about how someone with level 0 clearance had managed to secure an appointment in Section 7 Alpha. The question hung in the air like a challenge, an opportunity for Nora to prove she belonged among titans of science and technology. "Information science," Nora replied simply, adjusting her worn leather satchel on her shoulder. The response drew barely concealed smirks from the assembled researchers. Information science, the academic equivalent of saying you were a professional organizer. While they dealt with cutting-edge quantum mechanics, revolutionary biotechnology, and classified government research, she apparently spent her time cataloging books and teaching people how to use search engines. Dr. Singh, whose work on cybersecurity had been consulted by 3 different presidential administrations, couldn't resist probing further. "Information science, how practical, and where did you complete your doctoral studies?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to expose exactly how far out of her depth Nora truly was. At Thornfield, doctoral credentials were merely the entry point. Most researchers held multiple advanced degrees from institutions whose names alone opened doors worldwide. "I didn't," Nora said quietly, seemingly unaware of the collective intake of breath her admission caused. "I have a master's degree in library and information science from Riverside State University." The silence that followed was deafening. Riverside State wasn't even on the radar of serious academic institutions. It was the kind of place where people went when they couldn't get into anywhere else. The academic equivalent of a community college with delusions of grandeur. The security guard, Marcus Ironwood, who had worked at Thornfield for 8 years and had processed thousands of distinguished visitors, had never encountered someone quite like Nora. Distinguished professors typically arrived with assistants carrying their materials, speaking importantly into phones about urgent matters. Nobel laureates commanded immediate attention and deference. Government consultants moved with the swagger of people accustomed to having their expertise shape national policy. But Nora carried her own bag, waited patiently in line like any ordinary visitor, and seemed genuinely surprised when the security protocols treated her differently than everyone else. When the scanner rejected her card twice before finally accepting it, she didn't demand to speak to supervisors or threaten to call Director Brambleworth's office. She simply waited, as if she were used to systems not working properly for her. Used to being the person for whom exceptions had to be made rather than the person who commanded them. The most telling moment came when Dr. Vex, feeling somewhat sorry for this obviously confused woman, offered what he considered helpful advice. "Listen, Miss Castellane, was it? I think there might be some administrative error here. Section 7 Alpha contains highly classified research materials. Even with proper clearance, accessing those files requires specialized knowledge of quantum encryption protocols, advanced database architecture, and classified security procedures. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable starting with our public research database. It has some lovely historical documents about the Institute's founding." His tone was the kind used with children or elderly relatives, patient, condescending, designed to gently guide someone away from situations beyond their comprehension. The other researchers nodded approvingly at his diplomatic handling of an awkward situation. Clearly, someone in the administrative office had made a serious mistake, and Dr. Vex was graciously offering this poor woman a face-saving exit strategy. But Nora's response surprised them all. She didn't seem embarrassed or flustered by the revelation that she was attempting to access materials beyond her apparent qualifications. Instead, she simply looked at Dr. Vex with those unremarkable brown eyes and said, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm exactly where I need to be." Her voice carried no defensiveness, no anger at being dismissed, just quiet certainty that made the researchers exchange uncomfortable glances. There was something unsettling about her composure, something that suggested she knew something they didn't. But looking at her, this small, plainly dressed woman, with her discount store clothes and state school credentials and Level 0 library card, what could she possibly know that they didn't? They were about to find out. The elevator ride to Section 7 Alpha became an exercise in subtle exclusion that Nora had clearly experienced many times before. Dr. Vex and his colleagues naturally gravitated toward each other, forming a tight cluster that left her standing alone by the control panel. Their conversation flowed seamlessly around topics designed to demonstrate their intellectual superiority, references to conferences she obviously hadn't attended, mentions of research grants she clearly hadn't received, casual name-dropping of Nobel laureates they apparently knew personally. The symposium in Geneva was absolutely fascinating this year, Dr. Singh remarked, her voice carrying just loud enough for Nora to hear. Although I suspect the quantum cryptography panel was a bit too technical for most attendees. Harrison, didn't you present that paper on advanced security protocols? The question was designed to showcase their elite status while simultaneously highlighting Nora's outsider position. After all, someone with Level 0 clearance from Riverside State University certainly hadn't been invited to present at international symposiums. Dr. Vex nodded gravely. Yes, well, when the Department of Defense specifically requests your expertise, you make time. Though I must say, the level of understanding among some attendees was disappointing. It's remarkable how many people think they understand cybersecurity without grasping the fundamental mathematical principles. He glanced meaningfully at Nora, as if she represented everything wrong with the democratization of technical knowledge. Nora stood quietly, studying the elevator's floor indicator with apparent fascination. She didn't attempt to join their conversation, didn't try to prove she belonged by mentioning her own qualifications or challenging their assumptions. Her silence seemed to confirm everything they suspected about her, that she was intellectually outmatched, probably intimidated by their obvious superiority, clearly uncomfortable in the presence of real scholars. When they reached the 7th floor, the exclusion became even more pronounced. The Section 7 Alpha Research Wing was designed like a university faculty lounge, with comfortable leather chairs arranged in conversational clusters, walls lined with prestigious awards and framed photographs of famous visitors, and coffee stations stocked with expensive imported beans. It was a space where brilliant minds gathered to exchange revolutionary ideas, where casual conversations often led to breakthrough discoveries. The other researchers immediately claimed territory near the central seating area, spreading their materials across the polished mahogany tables as if they owned the space. Dr. Tanaka opened her titanium briefcase and began arranging tablet computers with the precision of a surgeon preparing instruments. Dr. Howe pulled out a leather portfolio containing handwritten notes that he consulted with theatrical importance. Dr. Singh activated her secure laptop and began typing with the confident intensity of someone accessing state secrets. Nora, meanwhile, found herself directed toward a small desk in the corner, the kind of spot typically reserved for graduate assistants or visiting researchers who needed space, but weren't quite important enough to claim prime real estate. The desk was obviously an afterthought, squeezed between a filing cabinet and the wall, with a slightly wobbly chair that squeaked whenever she moved. It was the academic equivalent of the children's table at family gatherings, but rather than protest this obvious slight, Nora simply accepted the marginalized position with the same quiet resignation she'd shown throughout the morning. She pulled out her own materials, a worn notebook with a faded cover, several pencils that looked like they'd been sharpened by hand, and a collection of index cards held together with a rubber band. Her research tools looked primitive compared to the advanced technology surrounding her, reinforcing everyone's assumptions about her amateur status. The isolation deepened when Dr. Vex announced that his team would be conducting their research collaboratively. sharing insights and coordinating their efforts to maximize efficiency. "We'll need to access the classified databases simultaneously," he explained, cross-referencing information across multiple security protocols. "It requires a sophisticated understanding of how these systems interact." The implication was clear: this was work for professionals, not for someone whose highest qualification was organizing books. As the elite researchers began their collaborative session, their animated discussions filled the room with impressive-sounding technical jargon. They debated encryption algorithms with the confidence of people who'd helped design them, referenced classified projects with casual familiarity, and analyzed security vulnerabilities with the expertise of individuals who'd been personally briefed by intelligence agencies. Their work required constant communication, shared screen access, and coordinated database queries that demonstrated their mastery of the Institute's most advanced systems. Nora, by contrast, worked in complete silence. While they filled the air with important-sounding conversations, she simply opened her notebook and began writing. Not typing on a computer, not accessing advanced databases, not participating in the kind of high-level intellectual discourse that characterized serious research. Just writing by hand like a student taking notes in a basic library science class. The physical distance between her corner desk and their central workspace became symbolic of a deeper professional chasm. They belonged to a world of international conferences, government consulting, and revolutionary discoveries. She apparently belonged to a world of card catalogs and reading recommendations. They commanded respect through their obvious expertise. She seemed to command nothing at all. When a research assistant arrived with coffee service premium, imported blends served in fine china cups, the social hierarchy became even more apparent. The assistant naturally served the distinguished researchers first, engaging them in brief but respectful conversations about their work. Dr. Vex received updates about funding approvals. Dr. Singh was informed about scheduling requests from federal agencies. Dr. Tanaka was consulted about equipment specifications for upcoming experiments. By the time the assistant reached Nora's corner, the premium coffee had run out. "I'm sorry," the young man said with genuine apologetic concern. "We only have regular institutional coffee left. Would that be acceptable?" The question itself highlighted her secondary status. Distinguished researchers received the best, while she got whatever remained. "That's perfectly fine," Nora replied quietly, accepting the plain white ceramic mug without complaint. She didn't point out the obvious unfairness, didn't demand equal treatment, didn't use the moment to assert any claim to professional respect. Her gracious acceptance of second-class treatment only reinforced everyone's perception that she was accustomed to being overlooked, accustomed to receiving whatever was left over after important people had been served. But perhaps most telling was how she responded to the subtle attempts at intellectual intimidation that continued throughout the morning. When Dr. Howe loudly discussed the mathematical complexity of quantum encryption protocols, glancing her way to gauge whether she understood the terminology, Nora simply continued writing in her notebook. When Dr. Singh made casual references to briefings she'd received from the National Security Agency, clearly testing whether Nora would be impressed or intimidated, there was no visible reaction. Her composure, in the face of obvious condescension, suggested someone who'd learned to navigate hostile professional environments through patience rather than confrontation. She seemed to understand that proving herself through argument would be futile, that demanding respect would only invite further dismissal. Instead, she focused entirely on her work, whatever that work actually involved. As the morning progressed, the other researchers gradually forgot about her presence entirely. She became part of the furniture, no more noteworthy than the filing cabinet beside her desk. They spoke freely about sensitive projects, classified information, and confidential assessments of government cybersecurity weaknesses, apparently considering her too insignificant to pose any security risk. What they didn't notice was that while they talked, Nora was listening. And while she wrote in her seemingly primitive notebook, her handwriting was forming patterns that looked suspiciously like code, very sophisticated code, while the elite researchers debated theoretical frameworks and consulted their expensive equipment. Nora's seemingly primitive approach began, revealing layers of sophistication that would have shocked them if they'd been paying attention. Her worn notebook wasn't filled with casual observations or basic research notes. It contained hand-drawn network diagrams of stunning complexity, mathematical equations that bridged multiple disciplines, and detailed analyses of system vulnerabilities that demonstrated an understanding of cybersecurity architecture far beyond what her credentials suggested. The first hint of her extraordinary preparation came when she pulled out a small magnifying glass and began examining something that looked like a standard library barcode on the back of her Level 0 card. To casual observers, it appeared she was simply checking her identification, perhaps confused about why the security systems had initially rejected it. But her examination was methodical, systematic, following patterns that suggested she was reading information encoded in ways that normal barcodes didn't contain. What the other researchers couldn't see were the micro-perforations she was studying, tiny holes punched in precise patterns that formed a secondary identification system invisible to standard scanners. These perforations weren't random. They represented a binary code that corresponded to access protocols discontinued 15 years earlier, back when the Institute's security architecture operated on completely different principles. Nora wasn't confused about her clearance level. She was verifying that her card still contained the embedded authorizations that current staff had forgotten existed. Her preparation became even more evident when she began cross-referencing information from multiple sources with the speed and precision of someone who'd spent considerable time studying the Institute's systems. She consulted what appeared to be a simple address book, but her notations were actually a comprehensive directory of server locations, backup systems, and emergency protocols that weren't documented in any official manual. Each entry was written in a personal shorthand that condensed complex technical specifications into symbols she could quickly decode. The index cards held together with a rubber band revealed another layer of her obsessive preparation. While other researchers relied on digital databases and network access, Nora had created a complete analog backup of critical information. Each card contained hand-copied data about system configurations, security patches, and infrastructure, changes spanning decades of the Institute's operational history. She'd somehow managed to track modifications and updates that even current system administrators weren't fully aware of. Her pencils weren't random writing instruments, they were carefully selected for specific purposes. The harder graphite was used for permanent notations that needed to remain stable over time, while softer leads were reserved for temporary calculations and sketches. She'd even modified one pencil by wrapping colored thread around its shaft, in patterns that corresponded to different access levels and security classifications. Every tool in her possession served multiple purposes, suggesting someone who'd learned to work with limited resources while maintaining absolute precision. When Dr. Tanaka's advanced tablet computer began experiencing connectivity issues with the Institute's quantum encrypted network, she muttered frustrated complaints about the system's notorious instability. "These servers have been problematic for months," she said to Dr. Singh. "The quantum encryption protocols sometimes create authentication loops that lock out legitimate users." The comment was meant to showcase her familiarity with cutting-edge technology, but it also revealed her limited understanding of why those problems occurred. Nora glanced up from her notebook, and for just a moment, her expression suggested she could have explained exactly why Dr. Tanaka was experiencing difficulties. The authentication loops weren't random glitches. They were deliberate security features designed to prevent unauthorized access attempts using stolen credentials. The quantum encryption wasn't malfunctioning. It was working exactly as intended. creating false positives that required manual verification from security administrators. But instead of offering to help, Nora simply returned to her handwritten notes, adding what looked like timing calculations to her existing work. She was tracking the frequency of the authentication loops, correlating them with network traffic patterns and server load balances. Her amateur-looking research was actually a sophisticated analysis of the Institute's real-time security status, something that would have required administrative access to multiple classified monitoring systems. The depth of her preparation became most apparent when she began what looked like casual sketching in the margins of her notebook. The drawings appeared to be architectural diagrams, floor plans, elevation charts, and infrastructure layouts drawn with the precision of someone who'd studied the building's construction in extraordinary detail. She knew not just the location of every server room and network junction, but also the backup power systems, emergency communication protocols, and physical security measures that weren't visible to normal visitors. Her sketches included notations about cable routing through the building's infrastructure, backup generators in the sub-basement levels, and redundant network pathways that provided alternative access routes if primary systems failed. This wasn't information available in any public documentation. It represented the kind of institutional knowledge that took years to accumulate, the sort of detailed understanding that came from either working extensively with the systems or studying them with obsessive dedication. When she pulled out what appeared to be a simple calculator, careful observation would have revealed it was actually a specialized device capable of generating authentication codes for legacy security protocols. The calculator's display could switch between normal, mathematical functions and hexadecimal sequences that corresponded to encryption keys used in the Institute's older systems. She'd somehow acquired or modified equipment that allowed her to interface with security architectures that predated current technology by more than a decade. Her preparation extended to understanding the human elements of the Institute's security as well. She'd made careful notes about staff schedules, tracking which administrators worked which shifts, and when different security protocols were most likely to be active. She knew that certain high-level access attempts triggered automatic alerts to specific personnel, and she'd timed her visit to coincide with periods when those key individuals would be attending off-site conferences or meetings. Even her choice of clothing reflected careful planning. The unremarkable cardigan and sensible shoes weren't just modest fashion choices. They were selected to avoid triggering any security features that monitored for unusual behavior or suspicious accessories. Her worn leather satchel was made from materials that wouldn't interfere with electronic scanning equipment, and its contents were arranged to pass casual inspection while concealing the sophisticated tools. She'd brought the most remarkable aspect of her preparation was how she'd managed to acquire such detailed knowledge of the Institute's systems without anyone noticing. Her research had clearly taken years to compile, requiring access to historical documentation, archived technical manuals, and obsolete security protocols that most current staff didn't even know existed. She'd assembled a comprehensive understanding of the facility's vulnerabilities and capabilities that surpassed what many current employees possessed. As the morning progressed and the other researchers continued their collaborative work, occasionally glancing at Nora with mixture of pity and dismissal, she methodically worked through her handwritten checklists with the focus of someone executing a carefully rehearsed plan. Every notation, every calculation, every seemingly casual observation was part of a preparation so thorough and sophisticated that it would have impressed the very people who were dismissing her as an amateur. But the most telling sign of her extraordinary preparation was something none of them could see: the slight smile that crossed her face when she verified that everything was exactly where she expected it to be. Because after 15 years of waiting, after years of patient preparation and careful planning, Nora Castellane was finally ready to show them what Level 0 clearance actually meant. She just needed to wait for the right moment. By midday, Nora had accomplished something that should have been impossible for someone with Level 0 clearance. She'd successfully accessed 3 different classified databases that even some gold-level researchers struggled to navigate. Her queries returned results with surgical precision, finding specific documents buried deep within the Institute's vast digital archives, while the distinguished researchers around her fumbled with basic search protocols and authentication errors. When Dr. Howe's secure terminal displayed an access-denied message for the 3rd time in an hour, his frustrated muttering filled the research wing. "These new security protocols are absolutely ridiculous," he complained to his colleagues. "I've been accessing these databases for 5 years, and suddenly the system doesn't recognize my credentials." His Cambridge-educated confidence was visibly shaken by technology that refused to acknowledge his obvious authority. Meanwhile, Nora had quietly retrieved a complete set of historical security architecture documents that detailed the exact evolution of the authentication systems Dr. Howe was struggling with. Her Level 0 access had somehow bypassed his difficulties entirely, pulling up files that contained not just the information he was seeking, but comprehensive context about why the security changes had been implemented and how to navigate them efficiently. She was reading through decades of classified development logs while he couldn't even access current operational manuals. The irony became even more pronounced when Dr. Singh encountered similar difficulties with the quantum encryption database. Despite her reputation as a cybersecurity expert who'd consulted for 3 presidential administrations, she found herself locked out of systems that should have been well within her expertise. "There's obviously some kind of technical malfunction," she announced with the authority of someone accustomed to having her assessments accepted without question. "The quantum protocols are generating false authentication loops that prevent legitimate access." But from her corner desk, Nora could see exactly what was happening. Dr. Singh's approach to the authentication system reflected theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience. She was attempting to access the databases using current security protocols without understanding that certain classified sections still operated on legacy systems that required different authentication methods. Nora's access attempts, guided by her hand-drawn network diagrams and obsolete reference materials, were successfully connecting to the older infrastructure that the distinguished researchers didn't even know existed. The most telling example of overlooked excellence came when Dr. Tanaka began working on what she described as a complex data correlation project that would demonstrate advanced analytical capabilities. She'd spent 45 minutes setting up multiple database connections, configuring specialized software, and preparing what appeared to be a sophisticated research approach that would showcase her technical mastery. Nora, who'd been quietly working through her index cards and handwritten notes, had completed a far more comprehensive correlation analysis using nothing more than pencil calculations and cross-referenced manual lookups. While Dr. Tanaka struggled to establish secure connections between different database systems, Nora had identified patterns spanning multiple decades of research data, traced the evolution of classified projects through various administrative reorganizations, and compiled a chronological analysis that revealed connections invisible to standard digital search methods. The quality of her work became evident when she began sketching network relationship diagrams that accurately mapped the Institute's complete organizational structure, including connections between departments that weren't documented in any official charts. Her hand-drawn analysis revealed reporting relationships, project dependencies, and administrative hierarchies that would have required weeks of investigation using conventional research methods. She was essentially reverse engineering the entire Institute's operational framework from scattered historical documents and archived communications. But perhaps the most remarkable demonstration of her overlooked capabilities came when the research wing's main server experienced what appeared to be routine maintenance issues. Dr. Vex, despite his platinum clearance and reputation for technical expertise, found his access severely limited as backup systems kicked in. "We'll probably need to wait for technical support," he announced with obvious frustration. These server transitions always create temporary access restrictions. While he waited for assistance, Nora had seamlessly shifted her research to alternative database pathways that remained fully operational during the maintenance period. She'd somehow anticipated the server issues and prepared backup access routes that allowed her to continue working without interruption. Her level 0 clearance was accessing redundant systems that the Platinum researchers didn't even know existed, pulling information from archive servers that had been disconnected from the main network for security purposes. The technical sophistication of her approach became clear when she began accessing historical backup files that contained earlier versions of documents the other researchers were trying to locate in current databases. While they searched for information that might have been modified or deleted over the years, she was reviewing original source materials that preserved the complete context of each document's creation and evolution. Her research wasn't just more thorough, it was more authoritative than anything they could accomplish using standard access methods. Even more impressive was her ability to cross-reference information between systems that weren't designed to communicate with each other. The Institute's security architecture deliberately isolated different types of classified information, requiring separate authentication protocols and specialized access procedures for each database. But Nora had somehow mapped the connections between these isolated systems, creating her own integration methods that allowed her to trace information across security boundaries that typically prevented comprehensive research. Her handwritten notes revealed correlation patterns that sophisticated computer analysis had missed. She'd identified relationships between research projects separated by decades, traced the migration of classified technologies through different departments, and documented decision-making processes that explained why certain research directions had been abandoned or modified. Her analog research methods were uncovering insights that digital analysis tools couldn't detect. The most striking example of her overlooked excellence occurred when Dr. Singh announced she'd successfully retrieved what she considered a significant classified document about early cybersecurity protocols. She presented her find with obvious pride, describing it as a breakthrough that would provide valuable historical context for their current research. The document she'd located contained 5 pages of basic security guidelines from 10 years earlier. Nora, without any fanfare or announcement, had simultaneously retrieved the complete 37-volume development archive for those same security protocols, including internal memos, technical specifications, testing reports, implementation challenges, and post-deployment evaluations that span 15 years of evolution. Her Level 0 access had somehow unlocked the entire historical record of the project Dr. Singh was celebrating finding a tiny fragment of. But the most frustrating aspect for anyone who might have been paying attention was how completely her achievements went unnoticed. The other researchers were so convinced of her inadequacy that they couldn't recognize superior performance when it was happening right in front of them. They saw her pencil and paper methods and assumed primitive incompetence, missing the fact that her results were more comprehensive, more accurate, and more insightful than anything their advanced technology was producing. When Dr. Howe mentioned struggling to understand the historical context of certain security implementations, he was literally sitting 30 feet away from someone who'd compiled the most complete analysis of that exact topic ever assembled. When Dr. Tanaka expressed frustration about incomplete data correlations, she was in the same room as research that had solved those correlation problems using methods her sophisticated software couldn't replicate. Their biases had created a blind spot so complete that excellence became invisible. They couldn't see past her appearance, her credentials, and her Level 0 clearance to recognize that she was outperforming all of them combined. They were so convinced of their own superiority that they couldn't imagine learning anything from someone they'd dismissed as obviously inadequate. But in 3 hours, when their carefully planned research day turned into a catastrophic crisis, those same biases would become their greatest vulnerability. Because while they'd been dismissing her as irrelevant, Nora had been preparing for something they couldn't even imagine. The crisis began with what appeared to be a routine system notification that flashed across every terminal in Section 7 Alpha at exactly 2:47 p.m. Scheduled maintenance. Quantum core systems will be offline for 15 minutes starting at 3 p.m. Dr. Vex glanced at the message with mild annoyance, noting that it would interrupt his afternoon research session. But such interruptions were common. Enough in a facility that operated cutting-edge technology, requiring constant updates and calibration. What none of the distinguished researchers realized was that this wasn't scheduled maintenance at all. Deep in the Institute's primary server facility, something catastrophic was beginning to unfold. The quantum computing core that managed the facility's entire digital infrastructure was experiencing cascading failures that system administrators didn't yet understand. The maintenance and notification was an automated response triggered when the core systems detected anomalies too severe for standard error correction protocols. By 3:15 p.m., when the promised 15-minute maintenance window had expired without systems coming back online, Dr. Singh began expressing the first hints of concern. "This is highly irregular," she announced to her colleagues. "Quantum systems don't typically require extended maintenance periods." She attempted to access her secure databases and found herself facing error messages she'd never encountered before. Core authentication unavailable, emergency protocols initiated. Dr. Tanaka, whose research depended on real-time access to classified computational models, discovered that her advanced software couldn't establish connections to any of the Institute's primary databases. Her tablet displays showed spinning loading icons that never resolved, timeout errors that cascaded across multiple applications, and authentication failures that seemed to multiply with each retry attempt. "Something seriously wrong with the network infrastructure," she reported with growing alarm. Within 30 minutes, the scope of the crisis became undeniably clear. The Institute's quantum computing core wasn't experiencing routine maintenance. It was suffering complete systemic failure. Every database, every security protocol, every authentication system, every backup server was either inaccessible or displaying critical error states. The facility's entire digital infrastructure, containing decades of classified research, sensitive government data, and irreplaceable scientific discoveries, was rapidly becoming unreachable. Dr. Howe attempted to contact technical support using the emergency communication protocols and discovered that even the internal phone systems were dependent on the failing quantum core. His secure satellite communication device, which should have provided backup connectivity to external support networks, displayed only cryptic error codes that suggested the quantum encryption keys necessary for secure transmission had become corrupted or inaccessible. The situation escalated from serious to catastrophic when Dr. Vex realized that the quantum core failure wasn't just preventing access to existing data, it was threatening the integrity of the information itself. Quantum storage systems relied on precisely maintained coherent states that required constant error correction and system monitoring. Without active management, the quantum data structures would begin deteriorating within hours, potentially causing permanent data loss on a scale that defied comprehension. Emergency alarms began sounding throughout the facility as automated systems detected the spreading failure. The Institute's disaster response protocols activated, sealing external communications and implementing lockdown procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access during security emergencies. But these same protective measures now trapped the researchers inside a facility whose digital infrastructure was collapsing around them. Director Cornelius Brambleworth's voice echoed through the emergency communication system, his typically calm administrative tone replaced by barely controlled urgency. All personnel are advised that we are experiencing critical system failures affecting primary computational infrastructure. Technical teams are working to restore functionality, but current estimates suggest complete system restoration may require 72 to 96 hours. The implications of his announcement sent shockwaves through the research community. 72 hours of quantum data deterioration would result in losses that couldn't be measured in mere dollars or years of research time. Classified government projects worth billions of dollars, scientific discoveries that had taken decades to achieve, and security protocols protecting national infrastructure, all of it existed in quantum storage systems that were now failing. Without the computational support necessary to maintain data integrity, Dr. Singh, despite her reputation as a cybersecurity expert, found herself completely helpless in the face of quantum system failures that exceeded her theoretical knowledge. Her expertise in traditional network security and encryption protocols provided no insight into the exotic physics governing quantum computational states. She could diagnose the symptoms of the crisis, but had no framework for understanding the underlying causes or potential solutions. Dr. Tanaka's situation was equally desperate. Her revolutionary work on quantum computing protocols had always assumed the existence of stable, properly functioning quantum infrastructure. She'd never considered scenarios where the fundamental computational environment itself became unreliable. Her advanced software tools and analytical methods were useless without the quantum processing power they were designed to leverage. The most chilling realization came when Dr. Vex attempted to access the Institute's emergency backup systems and discovered that even these supposedly independent resources were interconnected with the failing quantum core in ways that made complete restoration impossible using conventional approaches. The Institute's architects had created such an integrated, sophisticated digital environment that partial failures cascaded into total system collapse. External technical support teams, contacted through emergency communication channels, confirmed everyone's worst fears. The Institute's quantum computing infrastructure was so advanced, so customized, and so far beyond standard commercial technology that outside experts couldn't even access the systems remotely, much less diagnose or repair the quantum-level failures that were destroying decades of irreplaceable research. Government agencies began mobilizing emergency response teams, but even the most sophisticated technical specialists would require days to reach the facility, establish secure communication links, and begin the complex process of understanding systems that had been developed in complete secrecy. By the time external assistance arrived, the quantum data deterioration would have progressed beyond any hope of recovery. The financial implications alone were staggering. Insurance estimates suggested that complete data loss would represent damages exceeding $50 billion, not including the classified research whose value couldn't be calculated in monetary terms. National security implications were even more severe. Losing decades of cybersecurity development would leave critical infrastructure vulnerable to attacks that the lost research had been designed to prevent. As afternoon turned to evening, distinguished researchers who had begun their day confident in their intellectual superiority found themselves facing a crisis that exposed the limitations of their expertise. Their advanced degrees, prestigious appointments, and international reputations meant nothing in the face of quantum computational failures that none of them truly understood. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across Section 7 Alpha as backup power systems struggled to maintain basic facility operations. The comfortable research environment had been transformed into something resembling a technological disaster zone, with error messages glowing on darkened screens and the constant hum of cooling systems working overtime to prevent hardware failures that would compound the existing crisis. Dr. Vex, Dr. Singh, Dr. Tanaka, and Dr. Hao, four of the world's most respected experts in their respective fields, sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the magnitude of their helplessness. Everything they'd built their careers on, every assumption about their technological mastery, every belief in their intellectual superiority had been shattered by a crisis that rendered them as powerless as first-year graduate students. But in the corner of the room, Nora Castellane continued working quietly at her small desk, her pencil moving steadily across the pages of her worn notebook. While the quantum computing core failed spectacularly around them, while decades of digital research faced imminent destruction, while the world's leading experts sat paralyzed by the impossibility of their situation, she appeared to be solving something that looked suspiciously like exactly the problem everyone else had declared unsolvable. The turning point came when Director Brambleworth's voice crackled through the emergency speakers again, this time carrying the weight of desperation that no amount of administrative training could conceal. All personnel with any experience in legacy system architecture, quantum error correction, or historical database recovery are requested to report to Emergency Command Center Alpha immediately. This is not a drill. We are facing complete institutional data loss within the next 6 hours. Dr. Vex looked around the darkened research wing at his colleagues, each of them grappling with the uncomfortable realization that despite their impressive credentials, none of them possessed the specific expertise the crisis demanded. Their knowledge was broad but contemporary, focused on current technologies and modern approaches that were useless when the fundamental quantum infrastructure itself had failed. Legacy systems, Dr. Singh muttered with barely concealed frustration. Who even works with those anymore? Everything's been upgraded to quantum architecture for the past decade. Her comment reflected the attitude that had made her reputation in cutting-edge cybersecurity, always pushing to emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across Section 7 Alpha as backup power systems struggled to maintain basic facility operations. The comfortable research environment had been transformed into something resembling a technological disaster zone, with error messages glowing on darkened screens and the constant hum of cooling systems working overtime to prevent hardware failures that would compound the existing crisis. Dr. Vex, Dr. Singh, Dr. Tanaka, and Dr. Hao, four of the world's most respected experts in their respective fields, sat in stunned silence as they contemplated the magnitude of their helplessness. Everything they'd built their careers on, every assumption about their technological mastery, every belief in their intellectual superiority had been shattered by a crisis that rendered them as powerless as first-year graduate students. But in the corner of the room, Nora Castellane continued working quietly at her small desk, her pencil moving steadily across the pages of her worn notebook. While the quantum computing core failed spectacularly around them, while decades of digital research faced imminent destruction, while the world's leading experts sat paralyzed by the impossibility of their situation, she appeared to be solving something that looked suspiciously like exactly the problem everyone else had declared unsolvable. The turning point came when Director Brambleworth's voice crackled through the emergency speakers again, this time carrying the weight of desperation that no amount of administrative training could conceal. All personnel with any experience in legacy system architecture, quantum error correction, or historical database recovery are requested to report to Emergency Command Center Alpha immediately. This is not a drill. We are facing complete institutional data loss within the next 6 hours. Dr. Vex looked around the darkened research wing at his colleagues, each of them grappling with the uncomfortable realization that despite their impressive credentials, none of them possessed the specific expertise the crisis demanded. Their knowledge was broad but contemporary, focused on current technologies and modern approaches that were useless when the fundamental quantum infrastructure itself had failed. Legacy systems, Dr. Singh muttered with barely concealed frustration. Who even works with those anymore? Everything's been upgraded to quantum architecture for the past decade. Her comment reflected the attitude that had made her reputation in cutting-edge cybersecurity, always pushing toward the newest, most advanced solutions while dismissing older technologies as obsolete and irrelevant. Dr. Tanaka nodded in agreement. The Institute phased out all legacy infrastructure years ago. Even our backup systems are quantum integrated now. There's probably nobody left who understands the original architecture well enough to work around quantum failures. Her assessment was logical, reasonable, and completely wrong. But none of them realized it. It was then that Nora Castellane quietly closed her notebook, stood up from her corner desk, and spoke for the first time since the crisis had begun. "I have experience with legacy systems," she said simply, her voice carrying across the room with unexpected clarity, "and with quantum error correction protocols, and historical database recovery." The silence that followed her statement was profound and awkward. The four distinguished researchers turned to stare at her, with expressions that ranged from surprise to skepticism to barely concealed amusement. Here was this small woman with her level 0 clearance and state school credentials, claiming expertise in exactly the areas that the world's leading experts couldn't handle. Dr. Howe was the first to respond, his Cambridge accent adding extra condescension to what he probably considered diplomatic management of an embarrassing situation. "Miss Castellane, I appreciate your willingness to help, but these are extraordinarily complex systems requiring decades of specialized knowledge. The Institute's legacy architecture involves classified quantum classical hybrid protocols that were implemented using modified Forrester-Chun encryption bridges with backward-compatible authentication tokens stored in hexadecimal format on secondary storage media," Nora finished quietly, pulling her worn library card from her pocket. The legacy systems weren't actually removed when the quantum upgrade occurred. They were integrated as fail-safe backup infrastructure, accessible through specific authentication protocols that most current staff weren't trained to recognize. The researchers exchanged glances that mixed confusion with growing unease. Nora's technical language was precise, specific, and far more detailed than anything they'd heard from her all day. But the idea that someone with her apparent qualifications could possess knowledge they lacked challenged fundamental assumptions about expertise and institutional hierarchy. Dr. Vex attempted to regain control of the situation through what he considered gentle reality checking. The Forrester-Chun protocols were classified research from 15 years ago. Access to that information required the highest security clearances and direct involvement in the original implementation. Most of us haven't seen the actual technical specifications. His tone suggested that while he appreciated her enthusiasm, she was obviously confused about the complexity of what they were discussing. But Nora simply held up her level 0 library card, pointing to the barely visible micro-perforations along its edge. Level 0 clearance wasn't discontinued because it was obsolete, she explained with patience that suggested she'd expected this conversation. It was reclassified because it provided access to systems that the Institute wanted to forget existed. Systems that were too dangerous to document in modern databases, but too important to completely eliminate. She walked toward the center of the room, her movements deliberate and confident in a way that none of them had observed before. The quiet, marginalized researcher from the corner desk was transforming into someone who commanded attention through knowledge rather than credentials. "The quantum core failure isn't random," she continued. "It's a cascading error pattern that occurs when modern quantum systems try to interface with legacy architecture during high-stress computational loads. The error correction protocols are conflicting with each other." Dr. Singh, despite her growing discomfort with the direction of the conversation, couldn't resist testing Nora's claims. "If you understand these systems so well, then you should know that quantum error correction requires real-time coherence, monitoring using specialized equipment that we don't have access to during a core failure. The computational requirements alone make manual intervention impossible." Nora opened her notebook and showed them a hand-drawn diagram that depicted the Institute's complete quantum classical integration architecture, including subsystems that weren't documented in any official schematic. Manual intervention isn't necessary. If you understand that the legacy systems were designed to operate independently during quantum failures that recognize level 0 as legacy administrative access. Nora interrupted, sliding her library card through what looked like an ordinary card reader near the emergency communication panel. The reader, which had been displaying error messages all afternoon, suddenly came alive with options and interfaces that none of them had seen before. The emergency lighting in the room shifted from red warning status to amber standby mode as Nora's access activated dormant systems throughout the facility. Screens that had been dark for hours began displaying diagnostic information in formats that predated the modern interface designs. She wasn't accessing the failed quantum systems, she was accessing the parallel infrastructure that had been waiting in standby mode for exactly this type of emergency. Dr. Brambleworth needs to know that legacy failsafe activation is possible, she said, her transformation from dismissed outsider to technical authority now complete. But the procedures require someone who understands both the historical protocols and the current quantum architecture. Someone who can bridge 15 years of technological evolution using authentication methods that most current staff don't know exist. She looked directly at each of the distinguished researchers who had spent the day dismissing her competence. The question isn't whether I'm qualified to help. The question is whether you're willing to let me try something that conventional expertise can't accomplish. For the first time since the crisis began, Dr. Vex, Dr. Singh, Dr. Tanaka, and Dr. Howe found themselves facing the possibility that their salvation might come from the person they'd considered least capable of helping them. The person they'd laughed at was offering to save them all. What happened next defied every assumption the distinguished researchers had made about technical expertise, institutional knowledge, and the relationship between credentials and capability. Nora moved through the Institute's failing infrastructure with the precision of a master surgeon performing a life-saving operation, her every action revealing layers of understanding that transformed the impossible into the inevitable. Her first move was to activate what she called the Thornfield protocol, a recovery sequence that none of the current staff knew existed. Using her level 0 card in combination with authentication codes generated by her modified calculator, she began awakening legacy systems that had been dormant for over a decade. These weren't the crude backup systems that Dr. Vex had imagined, but sophisticated parallel networks that had been designed to operate independently of the quantum infrastructure while maintaining full compatibility with modern security requirements. The transformation was immediate and startling. Screens throughout Section 7 Alpha began displaying diagnostic information in interfaces that predated the current design standards, but provided far more detailed system status than the modern displays ever had. Nora was accessing real-time monitoring data for every component of the Institute's infrastructure, including subsystems that the current technical staff didn't even know were being monitored. The quantum failure started in Processing Cluster 7, she explained as she worked, her hands moving across manual control interfaces that emerged from panels the other researchers hadn't known existed. But the cascade effect is spreading through interconnected nodes, because the error correction protocols are trying to compensate for problems they weren't designed to handle. The legacy systems can isolate the failure and prevent further spreading while we implement controlled restoration. Dr. Singh watched in fascination as Nora manipulated controls that seemed to belong to a completely different technological era, yet somehow integrated seamlessly with the Institute's most advanced systems. How is this possible? She asked, her voice mixing professional curiosity with personal amazement. These legacy interfaces should be completely incompatible with current network architectures. Without pausing in her work, Nora pulled up a schematic that showed the true complexity of the Institute's infrastructure, not just the visible quantum systems that everyone knew about, but the hidden legacy networks that provided redundancy, backup processing, and emergency capabilities that had never been documented in modern technical manuals. Dr. Rebecca Thornfield believed in defense in depth, she explained. She designed the legacy systems to be invisible to normal operations, but capable of taking over complete facility management during catastrophic failures. Her next sequence of actions demonstrated mastery of systems that went far beyond theoretical knowledge. She began manually rerouting network traffic through pathways that bypassed the failing quantum processors, using legacy routing protocols that were apparently still active and fully functional. The process required her to calculate optimal data paths in real time, balancing system loads across dozens of different processing nodes while maintaining security protocols that spanned multiple generations of encryption technology. Dr. Tanaka, whose expertise in quantum computing had made her internationally famous, found herself watching techniques that challenged her understanding of what was possible with hybrid quantum classical systems. You're manually managing coherent states across systems that shouldn't be able to communicate with each other, she observed with growing awe. The computational requirements for those calculations should exceed what any individual could perform. But Nora had prepared for exactly these calculations. Her handwritten notes weren't random observations. They were pre-computed solutions for every possible failure scenario the Institute's systems might encounter. She'd spent years analyzing the mathematical relationships between quantum and classical processing, creating manual calculation methods that could substitute for automated systems during emergencies. The most remarkable demonstration of her capabilities came when she began the actual quantum system restoration. This wasn't simply a matter of restarting failed equipment. It required understanding the precise quantum states that had been corrupted during the cascade failure and manually recalculating the error correction codes necessary to restore data integrity, using techniques that combined advanced mathematics with physical understanding of quantum mechanics. Nora began rebuilding the computational environment from first principles. She accessed historical quantum state records stored in the legacy systems, cross-referenced them with current failure diagnostics, and manually generated the restoration sequences necessary to bring the quantum core back online without losing the data that remained in deteriorating storage. Her work required constant monitoring of multiple systems simultaneously. She tracked quantum coherence measurements on one display, while calculating error correction algorithms on another, all while maintaining manual control of legacy systems that were providing temporary processing for critical operations. The cognitive load of managing so many complex technical processes simultaneously should have been impossible for any individual, but Nora had trained for this exact scenario. Her obsessive preparation wasn't academic study. It was operational readiness for a crisis she'd known would eventually occur. Every calculation method, every system interaction, every backup procedure had been practiced until it became instinctive. As she worked, the Institute systems began responding in ways that none of the watching researchers had thought possible. Database connections that had been severed for hours suddenly re-established themselves. Quantum processing nodes that had been completely unresponsive began showing signs of controlled reactivation. Security protocols that had been frozen by cascade failures started operating normally again. She's not just fixing the immediate problem, Dr. Howe realized with amazement. She's implementing permanent improvements to prevent this type of failure from happening again. Indeed, Nora's restoration procedures were incorporating safeguards and monitoring systems that would make the Institute's infrastructure more resilient than it had been before the crisis. The technical sophistication of her approach became even more apparent when she began coordinating between systems that had never been designed to work together. Legacy monitoring equipment from the Institute's early years was suddenly providing real-time data about quantum processing states, while modern security protocols were accepting authentication from backup systems that predated current encryption. Standards. "This is impossible," Dr. Vex muttered, but his tone carried wonder rather than skepticism. "You're making systems communicate across 15 years of technological evolution. The compatibility issues alone should make this completely unworkable." Nora glanced up from her work long enough to offer a slight smile. "Compatibility isn't the problem when you understand that Dr. Thornfield designed the legacy systems to be future compatible. She anticipated technological evolution and built adaptation protocols into the foundation architecture. The modern quantum systems weren't built to replace the legacy infrastructure, they were built to enhance it." Her final sequence of actions demonstrated the full scope of her extraordinary capabilities. She began bringing the quantum core back online in stages, carefully monitoring system responses and adjusting parameters in real time to ensure stable restoration. This wasn't the brutal restart that emergency protocols would have attempted. It was a carefully orchestrated revival that preserved data integrity while implementing the Wozing-Le system improvements necessary to prevent future failures. As quantum processing power gradually returned to normal levels, Nora simultaneously began transferring temporary operations from legacy systems back to their modern counterparts. The transition was seamless, invisible to end users, and resulted in an infrastructure that was more stable and more secure than it had been before the crisis began. Within 6 hours of stepping forward to volunteer her help, Nora had accomplished something that teams of expert consultants would have required weeks to attempt. She'd not only prevented catastrophic data loss worth billions of dollars, but had actually improved the Institute's capabilities in ways that would benefit future research for decades to come. When the last system status indicator turned from amber to green, when the final quantum coherence measurement stabilized within normal parameters, when the emergency lighting finally switched back to normal operation, the distinguished researchers who had begun their day mocking her inadequacy found themselves witnessing the completion of the most sophisticated technical rescue in the Institute's history. Nora quietly closed her notebook, unplugged her calculator, and began gathering her simple tools with the same unassuming efficiency she'd shown all day. But now her movements carried the weight of demonstrated mastery that could never again be dismissed or overlooked. She'd just saved them all. The silence that followed Nora's completion of the impossible rescue was unlike anything the distinguished researchers had ever experienced. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of contemplation or the satisfied pause after successful collaboration. It was the profound, unsettling silence of worldviews being shattered in real time. 4 of the world's most respected experts in their fields sat motionless, staring at the small woman who had just accomplished something they couldn't even comprehend, let alone replicate. Dr. Harrison Vex, who had built his reputation on commanding respect through intellectual authority, found himself unable to form coherent words. His platinum clearance, his consulting relationships with world governments, his decades of experience in cutting-edge cybersecurity, none of it had prepared him for this moment of complete professional humility. The woman he'd dismissed as obviously inadequate had just demonstrated technical mastery that exceeded anything he'd witnessed in his entire career. That's not possible," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he spoke, the evidence surrounded them. Every screen in Section 7 Alpha displayed normal operating parameters. Every system that had been failing catastrophically 6 hours earlier was now functioning at optimal levels. The quantum core that had threatened to destroy decades of irreplaceable research was humming along as if the crisis had never occurred. Dr. Amara Singh, whose cybersecurity expertise had been consulted by 3 presidential administrations, was experiencing something she'd never encountered before: the complete inadequacy of her professional knowledge. She'd spent the day watching someone with level 0 clearance and a degree from a state school accomplish feats that she couldn't even understand, let alone replicate. Her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to access her secure databases, and found them not just restored, but operating more efficiently than they had before the crisis. "The quantum error correction protocols," she said, her voice reflecting genuine bewilderment. "The way you manually recalculated those coherent states. The computational complexity alone should have required supercomputer processing power. How did you perform those calculations by hand?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge to the fundamental laws of mathematics and physics. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, whose revolutionary work on quantum computing had earned her international recognition, found herself confronting the uncomfortable realization that her understanding of the field was apparently incomplete. She'd watched Nora manipulate quantum classical hybrid systems using techniques that didn't exist in any academic literature, combining theoretical approaches from different decades of research in ways that shouldn't have been compatible. "The legacy integration protocols," she said slowly, as if speaking to herself. "You weren't just accessing old systems. You were making them communicate with modern quantum architecture in ways that we didn't know were possible. The technical specifications for that kind of integration don't exist. How did you know how to bridge technologies separated by 15 years of evolution?" But perhaps the most profound transformation was occurring in Dr. Reginald Howe, whose Cambridge education and aristocratic bearing had taught him to recognize intellectual hierarchy through traditional markers of achievement. His entire framework for evaluating competence had been based on credentials, institutional affiliations, and peer recognition markers that Nora possessed none of, yet had just demonstrated capabilities that surpassed everyone he'd ever considered. His intellectual equal. "The Thornfield Protocol," he said, struggling to process what he'd witnessed. "You activated systems that we didn't even know existed, using authentication methods that predate current security architecture. You have knowledge of this facility's infrastructure that exceeds what most of the current staff possesses. Where did you acquire this information? How is it possible for someone with level 0 clearance to understand systems that even Director Brambleworth doesn't fully comprehend?" The questions kept coming, each one revealing another layer of their stunned incomprehension. They'd watched her manually manage dozens of complex technical processes simultaneously, perform mathematical calculations that should have required advanced computational support, and coordinate between systems that weren't supposed to be compatible. Every assumption they'd made about expertise, intelligence, and professional capability had been systematically demolished. Director Brambleworth's voice echoed through the emergency communication system, but now his tone carried relief rather than desperation. "All sections report normal operational status. The crisis has been resolved through implementation of previously unknown emergency protocols. Technical teams are requesting information about the restoration procedures for documentation and future reference." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The technical teams that Director Brambleworth was referencing, the Institute's most qualified experts, the specialists who'd been called in to handle the emergency, were asking for information about procedures that had been developed and implemented by someone they dismissed as unqualified to be in the same building. Dr. Singh attempted to process the professional implications of what had occurred. "You just saved research worth billions of dollars," she said, her voice mixing awe with professional horror at her own previous dismissiveness. "You prevented data loss that would have set back multiple fields of scientific research by decades. You accomplished something that teams of specialists said was impossible. How are you even here? How did someone with your capabilities end up with level 0 clearance at a research appointment that nobody took seriously?" The question revealed the depth of their confusion. They'd spent the day treating her as an outsider who didn't belong in their world of elite expertise, but she'd just demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that suggested she understood their world better than they did. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they thought they knew about professional competence had been proven wrong by someone who represented everything they'd been taught to dismiss. Dr. Tanaka was studying the diagnostic displays with growing amazement. "The system improvements you implemented," she said slowly. "These aren't just repairs. They're enhancements that make our infrastructure more resilient than it was originally designed to be. You didn't just fix the immediate problem. You solved problems we didn't even know we had. The monitoring systems you activated will prevent this type of cascade failure from ever happening again." But the most chilling realization was yet to come. As they began to understand the scope of what Nora had accomplished, they also began to grasp the implications of what they'd almost lost through their own prejudices. If they'd succeeded in discouraging her from volunteering, if their dismissive attitudes had convinced her that her help wasn't wanted, if she'd simply left the building when the crisis began, the Institute would have suffered the most catastrophic data loss in scientific history. Their biases hadn't just been wrong, they'd been dangerous. Their assumptions about credentials and institutional hierarchy had nearly cost them everything. The person they'd considered least qualified to help had been the only person capable of preventing complete disaster. Dr. Vex found himself staring at Nora's worn library card, the simple plastic rectangle that had triggered their morning of mockery. "Level 0, he said quietly. "We thought it meant you had the lowest possible access. But it actually meant something completely different, didn't it?" For the first time since completing her work, Nora looked directly at each of them with an expression that mixed patience with something that might have been sadness. "Level 0 isn't the bottom of the hierarchy," she said simply. "It's outside the hierarchy entirely. It's access that predates your current classification system, designed for people who understand the Institute's infrastructure at a level that modern security protocols can't properly categorize." The admission hung in the air like a revelation that recontextualized everything they thought they understood about the facility they worked in, the systems they relied on, and the woman they'd dismissed. They'd been working in a building whose most critical capabilities were accessible only to someone they'd considered unqualified to be there. The woman they'd laughed at for having the wrong clearance level was the only person in the building who'd possessed the right knowledge to save them all. And as that realization settled over them like a weight they'd have to carry for the rest of their careers, they understood that nothing would ever look the same again. Their certainty about expertise had been shattered. Their assumptions about intelligence had been proven wrong. Their beliefs about professional competence had been demolished by someone they'd never bothered to take seriously. And somewhere in the depths of their stunned recognition, they were beginning to suspect that this moment of revelation was only the beginning of discoveries that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about the woman who just saved their world. The revelation came when Dr. Singh, still reeling from the magnitude of what she'd witnessed, accessed her secure government database to file an incident report about the crisis resolution. What she found in the classified personnel archives made her question everything she thought she understood about institutional memory and the price of speaking truth to power. "Dr. Nora Castellane," she read aloud from her screen, her voice carrying growing astonishment with each line. "Former Chief Systems Architect, Thornfield Institute Advanced Infrastructure Division. Primary designer of the Quantum Classical Integration Protocols. Lead developer of the Institute's core security architecture. Holder of 17 patents in quantum computing applications." She paused, looking up at Nora with an expression of profound confusion. "This says you were the principal architect of the systems you just saved." The comfortable assumptions about Nora's background, the state school education, the simple library science degree, the level 0 clearance that suggested minimal qualifications, all of it crumbled as Dr. Singh continued reading from files that painted a completely different picture. Advanced degrees in quantum physics, computer science, and information theory from Stanford, MIT, and Caltech. Dissertation advisor, Dr. Rebecca Thornfield herself. Former clearance level, Omega-7, that's higher than any of us have ever held. Dr. Tanaka leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overriding her embarrassment about the day's misjudgments. Omega-7 clearance was discontinued 12 years ago. It was reserved for people who had architect-level access to systems so sensitive that their existence couldn't be officially acknowledged. If you held that clearance, you were essentially part of the Institute's foundational infrastructure. But the real story emerged as Dr. Singh accessed deeper levels of the classified archive, revealing a narrative that explained both Nora's extraordinary capabilities and her current marginalized status. Project Prometheus, she read, her voice becoming quieter as she grasped the implications. A classified initiative to develop quantum computing applications for national defense. Dr. Castellane served as technical director from 2019 to 2022, overseeing development of systems that were subsequently integrated into critical government infrastructure. The Project Prometheus files told a story of brilliant innovation shadowed by ethical concerns that had ultimately destroyed careers and rewritten institutional history. Nora had led a team of the world's most talented researchers in developing quantum computing applications that promised revolutionary advances in cybersecurity, communications, and data processing. Their work had been so successful that it attracted attention from government agencies, seeking to weaponize the technology for surveillance and control applications that violated every principle of academic freedom and individual privacy. The resignation letter, Dr. Howe said quietly, reading over Dr. Singh's shoulder. She tried to prevent the militarization of her research by formally objecting to unauthorized applications of her work. When her concerns were dismissed, she submitted detailed documentation about how the technology was being misused, violating both academic protocols and federal regulations governing research ethics. What followed was a textbook example of how institutions protect themselves by destroying the people who threatened their comfortable arrangements with power. Nora's ethical objections had been reframed as security violations. Her documentation of misuse had been classified as unauthorized disclosure of sensitive information. Her attempts to preserve academic integrity had been portrayed as betrayal of national security interests. They stripped her of all clearances, Dr. Vex read from another section of the file, revoked her academic appointments, froze her security clearances pending investigation of potential breaches. But they couldn't actually prosecute her because her objections were legally protected whistleblowing activities. So instead, they just made it impossible for her to work in her field. The systematic destruction of her professional life had been comprehensive and efficient. Research institutions were quietly informed that hiring her might affect their federal funding. Technology companies were warned that employing her could jeopardize their government contracts. Academic publishers were discouraged from accepting papers that bore her name. She'd been effectively exiled from the scientific community she'd helped build. The Level 0 clearance, Nora said quietly, speaking for the first time since the archive revelation had begun. It was the only way to maintain any access to systems I'd designed. Level 0 was created as a special classification for people whose knowledge was too valuable to completely eliminate, but too dangerous to officially acknowledge. It provides access to legacy systems while ensuring that modern databases don't recognize the clearance holder as having any significant authority. The cruel irony was evident to everyone in the room. The Institute had saved face by making her invisible, but they'd had to preserve some mechanism for accessing her expertise because the systems she'd designed were too complex for anyone else to fully understand. Level 0 clearance was their solution, a way to keep her knowledge available for emergencies while ensuring that she remained officially non-existent. For 3 years, Dr. Singh continued reading. Dr. Castellane worked as a contract librarian for various research institutions, maintaining minimal security clearances while pursuing appeals of her treatment through legal channels. All appeals were denied on national security grounds. Her original research was classified at levels that prevented her from discussing her own work in legal proceedings. The personal cost had been devastating. Her marriage had ended under the pressure of constant legal threats and professional ostracism. Her health had suffered from years of stress and uncertainty. Her financial situation had deteriorated as she'd been forced to accept employment far below her qualifications. She'd gone from being one of the most promising researchers of her generation to being a professional outcast whose very existence embarrassed the institutions that had benefited from her innovations. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her story was how completely the scientific community had accepted her erasure. Conferences she'd helped organize continued without mentioning her contributions. Research papers that built on her work cited her innovations without acknowledging her authorship. The systems that powered their daily research activities bore no visible trace of the woman who'd created them. The maintenance protocols you use today, Dr. Tanaka realized with growing horror. You weren't accessing systems someone else designed, you were fixing your own work. You know those legacy integration methods because you invented them. You understand the quantum classical interfaces because you built them. You could perform those manual calculations because you developed the mathematical frameworks they're based on. Nora nodded simply. I spent 15 years designing those systems to be resilient, adaptable, and capable of surviving the kind of political upheavals that destroy institutional memory. I built them to be accessible to people who understood the underlying principles, even if they'd been stripped of official authority. I never imagined I'd need to use those capabilities myself. The magnitude of the injustice was overwhelming. They'd spent the day dismissing someone whose work had made their own research possible. They'd mocked the intellectual capacity of the causity of the person who'd literally built the infrastructure that supported their careers. Their comfortable assumptions about expertise and institutional hierarchy had blinded them to the presence of someone whose contributions to their field exceeded their own combined achievements. The Institute owes you everything, Dr. Vex said quietly. Your research, your systems, your innovations, this entire facility exists because of work you did that was then taken away from you and attributed to others. And when we needed you most, when everything you'd built was failing, you saved it all despite having every reason to let it burn. But the most profound realization was still to come. As they processed the full scope of Nora's story, they began to understand that her presence at the Institute today hadn't been coincidental. She'd known the crisis was coming because she'd designed the systems well enough to predict their failure patterns. She'd prepared for this exact scenario because she'd understood that institutional knowledge had been lost along with her official exile. You came here today knowing this would happen, Dr. Singh said with growing amazement. You prepared for this crisis because you knew the Institute didn't have anyone left who could handle quantum classical integration failures. You've been waiting 3 years for the day when they'd need you badly enough to ignore your level 0 status. Nora's slight smile contained depths of pain, patience, and hard-won wisdom that spoke to the complexity of seeking justice in systems designed to protect themselves at any cost. I came here today because $50 billion of research and decades of scientific progress were worth saving, regardless of how that research community had treated me. I came here because some things are more important than personal vindication. The woman they'd mocked for her inadequacy had just taught them a lesson about integrity that would reshape how they understood the relationship between knowledge, power, and moral courage. The deeper truth about Nora's motivations emerged not through grand speeches or dramatic revelations, but through quiet admissions that revealed the complex psychology of someone who'd transformed personal devastation into purposeful service. As the other researchers struggled to process the magnitude of her backstory, she began sharing insights that illuminated the emotional journey from brilliant Innovator to exiled outcast to quiet guardian of knowledge. The hardest part wasn't losing my career, she said, settling back into the chair at her corner desk with the same unassuming manner she'd maintained all day. The hardest part was watching my research be twisted into tools for surveillance and control when I designed them to protect privacy and enhance human capability. Every time I read about government overreach using quantum encryption techniques, I knew that my work was being used to undermine the very freedoms it was meant to protect. Dr. Singh, still grappling with the revelation of Nora's true identity, found herself confronting uncomfortable questions about her own career choices. "But you could have fought back," she said, "with your credentials, your expertise, your documentation of the misuse. Surely you could have found ways to challenge the system that destroyed your career." Nora's response revealed the sophisticated understanding of institutional power that comes from being crushed by it. Fighting back would have required becoming the kind of person who prioritizes personal vindication over preventing harm. The legal battles would have taken years, consumed enormous resources, and ultimately changed nothing about how the technology was being misused. Meanwhile, the people who needed protection from surveillance overreach would have continued suffering, while I pursued justice that might never come. The psychological complexity of her choice became apparent as she described the internal struggle between seeking personal restoration and accepting a larger responsibility. "I had to decide whether I wanted to be Dr. Nora Castellane, wrongfully accused whistleblower seeking to clear her name, or just Nora, someone who understood dangerous technology well enough to prevent its misuse when opportunities arose." Dr. Tanaka, whose own career had been built on the foundation of recognition and professional advancement, found herself questioning assumptions about what constituted meaningful success. "But you sacrificed everything," she said with genuine bewilderment. "Your reputation, your research position, your financial security. How could you choose obscurity over fighting for the recognition you deserved?" "Because recognition was never the point," Nora replied with patience that suggested she'd had this conversation with herself many times over the years. "I didn't become a researcher to be famous or powerful. I became a researcher because I wanted to solve problems that mattered, to create tools that would help people, to push the boundaries of what was possible in ways that made the world better. When my research was stolen and perverted, fighting for credit would have been fighting for association with things I opposed." Her explanation revealed a philosophical framework that prioritized impact over identity, contribution over credit. She'd made peace with professional invisibility, because visibility would have meant being identified with research applications she found morally reprehensible. Better to be forgotten as Nora Castellane, the quantum architect, than remembered as the person whose innovations enabled authoritarian surveillance. "The exile was actually liberating in some ways," she continued, her voice carrying traces of hard-won acceptance. "When you're no longer competing for grants, publications, or professional advancement, you're free to focus entirely on the work itself. I spent 3 years in library positions where nobody expected brilliance from me, which gave me time to study problems without pressure to produce marketable solutions." Dr. Howe, whose Cambridge education had instilled deep appreciation for intellectual legacy, struggled to understand how someone could willingly abandon their place in academic history. "But your contributions to quantum computing, your innovations in security architecture, none of them bear your name anymore. Doesn't it bother you that other people receive credit for work you pioneered?" Nora's answer revealed the depth of her transformation from ambitious researcher to guardian of knowledge. Credit is a form of ego satisfaction that becomes irrelevant when you understand the real stakes involved. Every day that quantum surveillance systems operate without proper safeguards, real people suffer real consequences. Every time classified research is misused for political purposes, democratic institutions are weakened. Worrying about professional recognition while those harms continue would be a form of moral narcissism. The conversation revealed that her exile had forced a fundamental reconsideration of what constituted valuable work. In library positions, I learned to measure success differently, she explained. Instead of counting publications or citations, I started counting problems solved, people helped, knowledge preserved. Instead of seeking recognition for my expertise, I focused on applying that expertise where it could prevent harm or enable discovery. Her 3 years of professional exile had been far from idle. Working in research libraries had given her access to historical archives that revealed patterns of how scientific knowledge was weaponized throughout history. She'd studied case after case of brilliant innovations being twisted into tools of oppression and had begun developing frameworks for protecting research from misuse that went far beyond legal or regulatory approaches. I realized that the traditional academic model, publish everything, seek maximum visibility, compete for prestigious positions, actually makes research more vulnerable to appropriation by bad actors, she said. Sometimes the most responsible thing you can do with dangerous knowledge is keep it quiet until you can ensure it won't be misused. This philosophy had guided her approach to today's crisis. She could have used the emergency as an opportunity to demonstrate her continued relevance, to demand restoration of her professional status, to leverage the Institute's desperate need for her expertise into personal vindication. Instead, she'd focused entirely on preventing catastrophic loss while implementing safeguards that would protect future research from similar vulnerabilities. When I walked into the Institute this morning, I knew exactly what was going to happen, she admitted. Not the specific timing or technical details, but the general pattern. Systems I designed 15 years ago were reaching the limits of their operational parameters, and the institutional knowledge necessary to maintain them had been lost when I was exiled. I came here because I was probably the only person left who understood them well enough to prevent complete failure. Dr. Vex found himself confronting uncomfortable questions about his own motivations and priorities. You could have demanded anything, he said. Restoration of your clearances, public acknowledgement of your contributions, financial compensation for years of professional exile. Instead, you just fixed everything and asked for nothing. I asked for the only thing that mattered, Nora corrected gently. I asked for the chance to prevent $50 billion of research from being lost, to preserve scientific knowledge that thousands of researchers had contributed to protect discoveries that might benefit humanity for generations. Personal vindication is temporary satisfaction. Preserving knowledge is permanent contribution. Her transformation from ambitious researcher to guardian of knowledge represented a profound philosophical evolution that had been forged through suffering but refined through service. She discovered that influence without recognition could be more powerful than recognition without influence, that protecting knowledge from misuse was more important than receiving credit for creating it. The irony, she said with a slight smile that carried both sadness and satisfaction, is that losing everything I thought I wanted, the prestigious position, the professional recognition, the institutional authority, freed me to focus on the things that actually mattered. I couldn't be Dr. Nora Castellane, celebrated quantum researcher, anymore. But I could be Nora, the person who understood these systems well enough to keep them working when everyone else failed. The depth of her acceptance revealed someone who'd moved beyond bitterness into a form of wisdom that could only be earned through profound loss and patient rebuilding. She'd found purpose not in spite of her exile, but because of how it had clarified what truly mattered when everything else was stripped away. And in that clarity, she discovered that the most powerful form of expertise wasn't commanding recognition, it was being ready to help when help was needed most, regardless of whether anyone would ever know you'd been there. 3 months after the quantum crisis, the Thornfield Institute looked the same from the outside, gleaming glass and steel rising from the hills above Meridian City, its reputation for excellence intact and its operations running more smoothly than ever. But inside, everything had changed in ways that would reshape how the institution understood expertise, knowledge, and the relationship between credentials and capability. The transformation began with what Director Brambleworth called the Castellane protocols, new hiring and evaluation procedures designed to identify competence, regardless of how it was packaged. The Institute established anonymous technical challenges that allowed candidates to demonstrate capabilities without revealing their backgrounds, education levels, or institutional affiliations. Within weeks, they discovered remarkable talent hidden in unexpected places. A maintenance worker who developed breakthrough algorithms during night shifts, a cafeteria manager with insights into organizational efficiency that surpassed MBA-trained consultants, a security guard whose understanding of human behavior had applications in advanced psychological research. Dr. Harrison Vex, whose transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic, spearheaded the development of what became known as the Level 0 Initiative. This program specifically sought out individuals whose knowledge had been overlooked, dismissed, or deliberately marginalized by traditional academic and professional hierarchies. We learned that some of the most valuable expertise exists in people the system has taught us to ignore, he explained to a conference of research directors from around the world. Our biases don't just harm the people we dismiss, they deprive us of knowledge that could transform our work. The Level 0 Initiative became a model for institutions worldwide, demonstrating that diversity of thought required actively seeking perspectives that conventional recruitment methods systematically excluded. Universities began questioning admission standards that prioritize credentials over capability. Technology companies started hiring based on demonstrated skill rather than pedigreed backgrounds. Government agencies discovered that some of their most effective analysts came from backgrounds that traditional security clearance protocols had automatically disqualified. Dr. Amara Singh, meanwhile, had become an advocate for what she termed ethical expertise, the idea that technical knowledge carried moral responsibilities that transcended professional advancement. Her consulting work with government agencies now included mandatory discussions about how research might be misused and what safeguards should be implemented to prevent harmful applications. Nora taught us that being brilliant isn't enough, she would tell her clients. We have to be brilliant and responsible, capable and ethical, innovative and protective of the innovations we create. Her influence extended into academic curricula, where ethics courses became mandatory for all technical programs. Students learned not just how to solve complex problems, but how to anticipate the consequences of their solutions and design safeguards against misuse. The Castellane case study, as Nora's story became known in academic circles, was taught in universities around the world as an example of how institutional pressures could corrupt scientific integrity and how individual courage could protect knowledge from harmful applications. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had taken perhaps the most personal lesson from the crisis. Her research methodology now included mandatory consultation periods, where she would present her work to people outside her field, seeking perspectives that might reveal blind spots or unintended consequences she'd missed. I learned that expertise in isolation becomes dangerous, she explained to her graduate students. Real innovation requires humility about what we don't know and openness to insights from unexpected sources. Her laboratory became known for its collaborative approach, bringing together researchers from completely different backgrounds to work on projects that benefited from diverse perspectives. Quantum physicists worked alongside social workers to understand how advanced computing might affect community structures. Cybersecurity experts collaborated with ethicists to develop privacy protections that could evolve with changing technology. The cross-disciplinary approach produced innovations that none of the individual fields could have achieved in isolation. Dr. Reginald Howe's transformation was evident in his teaching methods at Cambridge, where he'd revolutionized how students learn to evaluate knowledge and expertise. Instead of emphasizing credentials and institutional prestige, his courses focused on developing judgment about the quality of ideas regardless of their source. Students learned to recognize brilliant insights that came from unexpected places, and to question assumptions about who qualified as an expert in any given field. The Thornfield incident taught us that intelligence and knowledge don't always present themselves in ways we've been trained to recognize, he would tell his classes. Some of the most important contributions to human knowledge have come from people who didn't fit conventional definitions of expertise. Our job as scholars is to develop the wisdom to recognize truth regardless of how it's packaged. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the institutional memory project that emerged from recognition of how close the Institute had come to losing irreplaceable knowledge. Nora's experience had demonstrated that exiling individuals often meant exiling the understanding they possessed, creating vulnerabilities that might not become apparent until crisis made them critical. The Institute established the Knowledge Preservation Initiative, a program designed to capture and protect institutional understanding that existed primarily in individual minds. Senior researchers were required to document not just their discoveries, but their problem-solving approaches, their understanding of system relationships, and their insights into how different technologies might evolve or interact. The goal was to ensure that knowledge could survive personnel changes, political upheavals, or institutional conflicts that might otherwise result in permanent loss of critical understanding. This documentation process revealed how much tacit knowledge existed in every organization understanding that experienced individuals took for granted, but that couldn't be easily transferred to others. Maintenance workers possessed insights into building systems that weren't captured in any manual. Administrative assistants understood organizational dynamics that influenced research outcomes in ways that weren't officially acknowledged. Security personnel had developed pattern recognition skills that could inform threat assessment procedures. The broader impact extended far beyond the Thornfield Institute. Organizations around the world began questioning their own assumptions about expertise and competence. Medical institutions discovered that patient insights often provided diagnostic clues that medical training had taught doctors to overlook. Technology companies found that customer service representatives sometimes understood user needs better than product designers with advanced degrees. Government agencies learned that field agents often possessed strategic insights that surpassed what policy analysts developed from theoretical frameworks. Nora herself remained characteristically resistant to recognition, even as her story became a catalyst for institutional change. She declined offers to return to prestigious research positions, turned down speaking engagements that would have restored her public profile, and refused opportunities for personal vindication that many people in her situation would have eagerly accepted. Instead, she continued working quietly in research libraries, now serving as an unofficial consultant for institutions that were implementing their own versions of the Level Zero initiative. Her role was to help organizations identify knowledge that existed in overlooked individuals and develop methods for integrating that understanding into formal decision-making processes. "The lesson isn't about me," she would say when pressed about her story's significance. "The lesson is about how much we lose when we let our assumptions about expertise blind us to knowledge that exists in unexpected places." Every organization, every community, every society contains wisdom that remains hidden because we've been taught to look for it only in certain people, with certain credentials, from certain backgrounds. The universal truth that emerged from the Thornfield crisis resonated far beyond scientific research or academic institutions. In boardrooms and classrooms, in government offices and community centers, people began questioning their own biases about who possessed valuable knowledge and what forms of expertise deserved recognition and respect. The story became a reminder that intelligence, capability, and wisdom could be found anywhere, often in people whose value had been systematically overlooked by systems designed to recognize only familiar forms of excellence. It challenged assumptions about meritocracy, demonstrated the dangers of institutional arrogance, and proved that some of the most important contributions came from individuals who'd been written off by conventional measures of success. But perhaps, most importantly, it established that true expertise wasn't about commanding recognition. It was about being ready to serve when service was needed, regardless of whether anyone would ever know you'd been there. In a world increasingly divided by credentials, status, and institutional hierarchies, Nora Castellane's legacy was a simple but revolutionary idea that the most valuable knowledge often comes from the people we've been taught not to see, and sometimes those invisible people are the only ones who can save us all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.